So I don't have slides because I just prefer browser tabs. I have a chaos brain. So thank you, Tobias, for the invite today. As Tobias mentioned, I'm here sort of as a bit of an outsider of GNOME. We did talk a little bit about, he mentioned just briefly that I've done a bit of work with like a kind of coaching or consultancy-based thing. And I've really kept in touch on and off with Tobias. And I also wanted to just say as well, thank you for like continually messaging me to get this talk in, because I know that I was a bit late getting that in. So I appreciate that. We do have a bit of feedback. I'm here today to kind of, at risk of sounding like someone coming from the outside in and sort of imposing anything, I'm here to do what I do as part of my work, which is to inspire a sense of strategic interest in like what could be the future. On screen right now you see the about page from my organization, which is New Design Congress. We've been around since 2020. We're based in Berlin, but we have people working in Japan and Switzerland and in London and England. And we are a research group that confronts the gap between what is said to be happening and what is actually happening. And no best can I describe how important this is, that there is a gap between what is said to be happening in digitized societies versus what is actually happening than these two things. This is an image, I was obsessed yesterday with the images of the CrowdStrike failures. Like, I absolutely love public blue screens of death. This is my favorite one in a Phoenix, Arizona advertising sign that has the recovery screen there from like a brute looping advertising billboard. The idea that a single vendor push can actually like basically down the entire global Windows corporate network, collection of networks is something that's been warned about for a long time, but obviously like hasn't been heeded because of here we are. But at the same time, that's kind of what is said to be happening at the same time is also can be summarized in the announcements or the rumors or the general kind of understanding that in the last, in some period of time in this year, there's been a decision by the European Union to kind of reduce funding in FOSS and redivert it into buzzword things like AI and other sort of more, let's say, unproven technologies. And I think what this demonstrates is the difference, right, between this idea of what is the next disruptive technology, these kind of narratives that are controlled by larger corporations and people who stand to gain a lot from the insertion of these new untested technologies, and the reality of the situation, which is that we still live in a world that is, the baseline is so brittle that it can be paralyzed very, very quickly, and we haven't solved for that yet. And so when we come back to the work that we do at New Design Congress, really this is why what I see us as being able to help contribute to a project like GNOME and other in the FOSS ecosystem, which is that we see projects like GNOME as being the unfulfilled or unappreciated touch points that could then become the thing that fills that gap between what is said to be happening and the actuality of what is happening. Is we're living through a period of extreme stagnation in digitized societies and a lack of imagination. Just a little bit about me so that I give myself a little bit of credibility. I got started as a designer, but then quickly moved into information security. I very accidentally started volunteering on the Signal GitHub repo before it was called Signal, back when it was called TechSecure. And these screenshots are from a, a piece of work that I did. How do I even do this? Can't scroll. All right, never mind. There's one screenshot from a beta version of Signal that made it into the hands of iOS users back at the very beginning of Signal. Before it was rolled back into what it became today. This is again early 2014. This is before Telegram. This is when WhatsApp still cost 99 cents to use. These sorts of things. And in that moment, I had a number of arguments with the leadership of Signal around things like using phone numbers to produce user accounts, and kind of argued that outside of the verification requirement and the US requirement, this was actually a really devastating thing to have happen in a promising digital security project, and that it would endanger people. And of course, you know, the rest is history. That became a major sticking point. I lost that battle, obviously. It became a problem. But I kind of realized that we needed more than just encryption. We needed other tools and other understandings of how people understand their own threats in order to start to respond to this erosion of the digital world that I saw. I grew up on the internet. I grew up believing that computers were really fun, and I was quickly finding that they're actually not fun because of the level of just sheer disasters that were happening on a really frequent basis. So I moved to Berlin in 2017, and I joined Tactical Tech, which some of you may also know, and I was the head of production and a digital security researcher there for 2.5 years. And in that time, made a lot of contacts and sort of did a lot of work on the side with different open source projects and things like that, but really became disillusioned by the idea that all we needed to do in that case was to just educate people, or otherwise highlight the political nature of data and surveillance to people, because things still weren't changing, right? Like, and today we're at this point where things are like almost as close as possible to the worst case scenario that you could possibly get in terms of the health of the internet and of digitized societies in general. I also, just as an aside, run a fairly popular, that probably nobody here knows about because it's a completely different circle of like subcultures and things, a pretty popular open source design resource that basically links all forms of like many different open source projects under one particular web page. And this is not something I keep, like I'm not super focused on, but it's something that has 1,000 followers and gets hits like 60 notifications every week of people using it in different ways and things like that. So there is a sort of underlying open source interest that I've had alongside the work that I've done with my employer, or my projects, fiscally sponsored project Superbloom. So how I got into GNOME was through the Prototype Fund. So 2 years ago, as Tobias said, there was the Prototype Fund gave a grant to the GNOME team to do some mobile designs, and I worked with them as a sort of consultant. They call it a coaching program, and in order to help strategize how best to organize, deploy, and gather feedback for the mobile work that they've been doing. And ever since then, I've been around the same time I started actually using Linux full time for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. But this was really where I started to understand the politics of what was going on beyond just the speculation, right? By actually speaking to people inside the team, and kind of began to sort of wallflower in the KDE spaces and GNOME spaces and things like that. And so the other thing that we've been doing at the same time, and I'll get to the point in a second, I'm just trying to sort of build a bridge of like a kind of understanding of all of the work that we do at New Design Congress. The other thing that we do is we run a complete self-hosted stack called Underscore. So New Design Congress and a handful of small partners that are aligned in interest, we basically, our entire operation runs on open source. We maintain it all ourselves. The only thing that we don't maintain ourselves is a Discord community that we run for our membership. Other than that, we run, because of the sensitive nature of some of the work that we do, we own all of our technology. If we do transcription of research interviews, we do it all on device with our own systems, and we run, everybody at New Design Congress runs Linux now. So we have like this position where we're both understanding things from like I would say like a conceptual threat modeling security company, but instead of doing penetration testing or things like that, we do things conceptually. Like we try to challenge the conceptual thinking of projects or leaders in open source projects, but we also dog food the whole thing. Like we use all of these tools ourselves. And today what I want to talk about is the beginning of the term, the title of the term, the title of the talk that's on the wall, which is like, after this, what comes next is nothing. As part of the membership, there's different people who can come and talk to New Design Congress, and we speak off the record and in private conversations with people. And when Twitter was bought by Elon Musk, I was asked by a couple of people, what's next? Like, what do we do? Do we need to fund something? Like, what happens next? And it was at this point where I was really developing this understanding of the stagnation that we see in digitized societies. And my basic response in the title of the email that I sent back is, what comes next is nothing, which is that I believed at the time that the promising alternatives, such as Mastodon, Blue Sky, Threads, all of these sorts of things, would maybe be moderately successful at the most, but would actually not replace Twitter in the same way as something like MySpace was replaced by Facebook or so forth. In fact, if you really look at things like Facebook, nothing has replaced that either. What comes after Facebook is nothing. It's just the decline of that particular platform itself. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I don't think it's just that people are burnt out on technologies or platforms, because there's a new generation of people using the internet, of which these should be people using the replacements. But I think actually the problem is that there is a gap between what is said to be happening, what is actually happening on the internet, and that over time, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a capture of imagination and a prioritization of policy by large tech companies, saying the usual suspects, and in its place is a promised future and an idea of what technology should become, which is completely frozen in place, where as we rely on public money or funding and proposals and things like that, rather than being able to come forth with new ideas and push them to funders such as the European Commission and others. Instead, we have to fall in line with blockchains or AI or these sorts of things, or we have to be building off of things that have already been built. And I know of stories of, from the design side of things, especially of projects that have produced very forward-thinking work that gets shelved as a result of it being too new in the last couple of years. And then when Apple or Microsoft comes out with the working version or an implementation of something similar, that's when that work then becomes viable to do. And I think we're reaching a point now, that's one example, but I think it's more systemic than that. I think we're reaching a point where it's a critical mass, where something has to change. This is really about raising the alarm about something here, because at the same time as things have stagnated in technology, we're also at this point where things have begun to fall apart in a really serious way. And nowhere has that been sort of serious, nowhere has that been more evident is in operating systems, right? And this is, again, why I come to talk to the GNOME, this sort of GNOME community here today, of people who are interested in GNOME. And that is that, for all intents and purposes, there's been more discourse in the last year about people switching to Linux than there has been in as long as I can remember. Windows in particular has had a particularly bad year. Between the Windows recall, the AI power thing. Let's hear it for Windows recall. Yes, thank you. Absolute disaster of a system. But then secondarily, as we've just talked about before, the idea of just large-scale, the brittleness of a duopoly, right? The brittleness of this kind of system that basically plagues the corporate world, which is essentially like a homogeneous Microsoft-based system. And while I think that it's exciting that GNOME and its competitive sort of spaces as the user interface layer are growing, I also think that we are collectively, as I said, trapped in this thing where, in order to maintain ourselves, in order to build consensus around what we should be building, the directions we should be traveling in, we are leaning too heavily and giving too much of that imagination over to the implementations that are already existing and the promises that have been set by big companies. And what I want to kind of do here is kind of look at what some of those things actually mean in real terms to start with, and give some very quick examples. I only have like 25 minutes, right? So this is like big stuff to talk about and sort of come here out of nowhere and show up and say, hey, things are kind of shitty in this particular way, and then like disappear 25 minutes later. But I want to give a concrete example of what some of these outcomes look like on a human level, and then move to something really optimistic, which is like, where do we find the future in unexpected places? Where do we find these new spaces that we can draw inspiration from? Now, to start with, now I want to preface this by saying that these graphs that I'm going to show you today are not they're three different studies taken at 3 different decades, and they do not represent the same methodology. They are quite different. So this is an extremely early hypothesis. I want to make that super clear. But if it's true, it's kind of worrying, right? The 3 things on my Zotero tabs here are the current age of open source or FOSS developers in 3 different surveys taken in 3 different contexts. The first one was taken in 2002, and as you can see here, The 21 is like the majority. So the majority really is like the sort of 21 to 29 age range here, right? This is in 2002, of like active participants in a social context, but also in a contribution context. In 2013, this is one taken where it actually split the starting age of FOSS contributors by binary gender. But as you can kind of see, this bit begins to move a little bit, slightly. It looks similar, but it's kind of dropping off from the 17 and sort of growing on the 29. This is in 2013. And for women, it's even worse, right? Like 20 and then 30, 29 and 31 are like the kind of, 33, 34 are like the highest ranking ones. And then in the third one, in 2020, this one's taken in 2020, what you see is a dramatic decline in 18 to 24, especially around like maintainers. This one is separated out instead of by gender. In this one, it's by role, right? But what you can see here is that the drop is substantial, and actually 35 to 34 is the sort of average, like the overarching overrepresentation of people in open source. And so what we're sort of seeing here, again, I want to make this super clear. These are 3 different studies that look at 3 different things, different kinds of things. But there is a trend towards people being older in open source. And it could be that over the last 10 to 15 years, the average age of someone in open source and the age in which they enter into open source is beginning to get older, which means, it could mean, it either means one of 2 things. Either people are, well, it means just generally that the distribution of ages is more, wider because people are getting older and people are coming in. But it also suggests that there are fewer people who are coming in at an earlier age than there are people who are in the community itself. So it's actually beginning to skew older. And I think if that's true, I think the reason why that is because there is a generational gap between, more broadly speaking in general terms, between people who are 25 and under and people who are a little bit older than that. And I think the reason for that, one of the reasons, is because historically we've seen computers as hobbies, right? The idea is that, again, speaking in very general terms, that the computer in an open source context is like a tinkering playground, something that you can really experiment with and actually derive some kind of satisfaction from understanding or tinkering with. But in a modern context, for someone who's a lot younger coming into the computing world, their experience of computing is more likely to be a lockdown system, be it a cell phone without a keyboard or an iPad or something similar to that, or a lockdown system where the work that they do is on top of the base layer of the operating system, right? So people working in web technologies, as an example, or people working primarily as video game designers, or people working in creative spaces that don't necessarily have to reckon directly, immediately with the concepts and the politics of open source versus closed source software. So there's a variety of reasons why, but I do think part of it is cultural. I think that alongside this capture of, or the insistence of policy to follow the lead of stagnant big tech companies, that we also are beginning to lose, there's a divergence between the younger people and the established groups of people within open source. And again, this is theoretical at this moment. I hope that I'm wrong, but I want to operate on the presumption that we're not wrong and that we can do something about this in order to prevent that from happening. Because either way, if we are able to, then what comes next is not nothing. What comes next is a new generation of people with new ideas. So, at the same time, one of the things, because I speak about this internally with my fiscal sponsor, Superbloom, they do a lot of work in design with and research with open source. And there's a theory inside that's held by a couple of people inside Superbloom that suggests that there's a declining level of digital literacy amongst younger people. That people, you probably heard stories like this, right? Like people don't like, younger people don't understand what a file is. So they struggle to like send an email with an attachment. Sort of, they can open the PDF unlike their boomer parents, but they can't, I don't know, like they don't know how to like set up a printer or something like that. So there's this understanding that there's a decline in digital literacy as a result of that. And I want to argue that I don't believe that that's the case. I think that what we have here is a unique opportunity where people are more comfortable than ever, younger generations of people are more comfortable than ever with computers, but rather that it is this stagnation that's foisted upon us that drives the disconnect and the divergence between people who are working in creative fields and who are highly technically literate in their specific areas, and the kind of AI-fascinated world that exists that leads to policy decisions like this one. And I want to give you an example, a historical example of who I think were one of the first people who, first groups that understood this. So this is an excerpt from Naomi Klein's new book, Doppelganger. Now, she's not paying me for this. This is a really good book. It's about how she started to be mistaken online for a conspiracy theorist, and as more and more people began to mistake her, the algorithm started to blend her and the conspiracy theorists together. So when she was in social media, she was basically being paired with a far-right reactionary at the time. And she's written this book about this called Doppelganger. It's extremely good. But in this early chapter, she talks about how Steve Bannon, who was one of the primary pioneering agitators for Gamergate and later one of Trump's acolytes, and he's actually been convicted of crimes very recently. But what I didn't know about Steve Bannon, which is highlighted in this book, is that before he started his political career, he worked in Hong Kong as at a multiplayer gaming company. And he understood that in order to get people to understand the savviness of complexity around them, that you could leverage the kind of their digital identity, their performative identity, what they brought out into the world, which is a mixture of creativity and sort of the social dynamics of a modern internet through multiplayer gaming, in order to harness and convert them into reactionaries. And Naomi Klein connects this to these sort of rising insurgencies in the United States, which of course, as we know right now, is a pretty upsetting sort of proposition right now. But it's a particularly interesting idea because what it demonstrates is a way in which, instead of seeing the world in very specific ways where the digital world is a sort of subset commodity of the wider world, instead she's making the point here that Bannon was able to make major changes in how people saw the world through the harnessing of this digital physical parallel reality, this para-real space where these two worlds could exist simultaneously and something more transformative and in this case quite uglier could exist. And so there is this kind of power that exists in technology that is beginning to be harnessed quite successfully by the far right. Meanwhile, that is not the case here. But this is connected. I think rather than, the reason why this is important is because what Bannon saw, and the important part about this, was the importance of games and gaming architecture and the role that complexity around the creative industries plays in creating and shaping political spaces. So this kind of spillage of the digital performance and identity and performative identities into the real world. And it's this in this, like, how much longer? God, I've got 3 minutes left. Okay, going to go over a little bit, I'm so sorry. It's in this space that I think that we can find the kernels that we can use to try to break out of this stagnation. And I want to start with this video. This is one of my favorite videos on the internet.
You playing Roblox?
Yeah,
okay, what are you, explain to me what you're doing though. You're playing Roblox.
Yeah, I'm playing Roblox. I'm taking money from people.
You're getting on the phone and then you're stealing money from people?
Yeah.
And you have this in your basement of your Roblox house.
Hold on. Don't disturb that.
I love the Windows XP.
Cade actually is helping. So
She's your intern?
yeah.
You have a whole office in your basement where you're scamming people?
Yeah.
So, yeah, we can watch that again. I want to point out as well that someone once came up to me where they were like playing on their device and only heard it, and they were like, "Wait, did they say you were the intern? Because Cade, C-A-D-E versus Kate, K-A-T-E." No,
You playing Roblox?
I'm not the intern.
Okay, what are you, explain to me what you're doing though. You're playing Roblox.
Yeah, I'm playing Roblox. I'm taking money from people.
You're getting on the phone and then you're stealing money from people?
Yeah.
And you have this in your basement of your Roblox house.
Hold on. don't disturb that. My intern Kate actually is helping. So
She's your intern?
yeah,
You have a whole office in your basement where you're scamming people?
yeah.
So Roblox, if you haven't heard of it, is this video game which is essentially a game engine and a social network in one that's very popular amongst like very young Gen Z and Gen A kind of kids. I don't like using, let's just use like real numbers. Like if you're 15 today and you were like 8 years old today or 6 years old today, there's a good chance that you historically in your childhood played Roblox or are currently playing Roblox. And it's essentially a 3D world that allows children to make and sell their own creations, kind of like, yeah, it's like a content creation system that's, that also allows for like building video games and things like that as well, or experiences inside of it. And it's a really interesting thing because the predatory nature of the system has led to, and there's lots of documentaries on this, People Make Games, which is a YouTube channel, has made a really great documentary on it. It's quite long, it's very in-depth. But the kind of, the labor laws, like the labor rights and the kind of exploitation of employees plays out because the system itself is designed in such a way that it rewards the exploitation of sort of younger kids who are able to like organize and then exploit other kids in their social network to create these games. You know, literally like getting kids to make art for your crappy Sonic the Hedgehog ripoff or your crappy Mario ripoff and then like not paying them in like Roblox money, right? Like it's that sort of thing. And the company's huge, right? It's an absolutely enormous company. But what's interesting about it is it kind of deflects the idea of this lack of literacy. It's this idea, whereas we understand that there's a lack of digital literacy, actually instead the literacy is sort of moved to a different space. And what we're seeing is like a kind of a literacy that's more in line with like capitalist survival and exploitation amongst younger kids, right? And that's it's both a really bleak concept, but it's also, we can also ask the question of like, how did it get here, right? What are the mechanics of something like this that makes this important? I'm not going to dive into that because that's like a whole multiple hours worth of talking. But instead what I want to do is kind of come out of the kind of dystopia of Steve Bannon and Roblox and move into like these kind of much more optimistic things that we can potentially learn from. So alongside this is, I didn't put up a tab for this, but I can show you other things. So one of the things that's super fascinating at the moment is the amount of incredibly lucrative but very, very well hidden Patreon-powered economy of Sims 4 content creators. That is people who create, usually teenagers, who create content for The Sims that's hair, GPU shaders, yeah, injecting DLLs at runtime. I mean, it's the most, I mean, imagine if the Matrix was that. That would be so dope, right? But you've got like basically 14-year-olds who are like building in crazy architecture. They're doing, you know, gameplay mods. They're writing GPU shaders. They're doing all these sorts of things and then releasing them. And so what you find over and over as we're doing this research, that you would find these content creators who have like, you know, I'm not going to like jump back and forth because it's too distracting, but who have like $5 membership tiers with 694 members, or you know, an average of like $10 in terms of $10 Patreon tiers with 2,000 members. You know, like these people, and this is like a large community of these sorts of people who are doing this, who have like 500 to 3,000 paid subscribers at a $5 to $10 rate, who are just basically spending, putting stuff out on a regular basis for their patrons and collecting like enough money. And more than one occasion during the research that we've done on this, we've gone to their Tumblr accounts, which is usually where, one of the main places where they put out items, and you'll just come to the end of the blog and it will say, sorry, I'm going to architecture school now. I've just graduated high school. I'm going to college now to study architecture. I don't have time for The Sims anymore. Please cancel your Patreon. And it's like this sort of world where you have this hacker ethos that's been, instead of diving into the depths of the system, instead it's diving into the depths of the rendering engine for The Sims 4 or the scripting engine of The Sims 4, and instead it's a completely different thing, but the literacy is still there. And not only that, but these people are then able to make a living of it while they're still at school, which is super crazy cool. Another example of this is this merging of infrastructure and and playfulness is this content delivery network called VRCDN, which is a community-run content delivery system that is a zero latency streaming system that allows for virtual nightclubs and services like VRChat to run essentially zero latency, multi-instance, yeah, I see that here, yeah, live events that are also copyright free. Because of course, if you're a DJ and you're playing sets of music, then your threat is YouTube and Twitch and stuff fingerprinting your audio and taking it down, even if it does fall under the terms of fair use in the United States. So again, this is a completely Patreon-based thing, but it's led to the explosion of VR clubs in the world. And then the third one that I wanted to just quickly sort of show off, I mean, I'll just jump over this. There's things like, again, teenagers making like hyper-realistic cyberpunk mods, right? And then collecting on Patreon. Again, having an understanding of how GPU shaders work and then inserting them, like in doing this directly into the system. And the final one I want to mention, just kind of quickly, is more directly, I didn't think I have a tab for this one either, but I would just grab it, but yeah, okay. So the furry community, which is, if you don't know what a furry is, it's a person who generates a performative identity based on them finding kinship with an animal species. They kind of curate themselves a performative identity, kind of similar to something like drag in the queer space, and then they inhabit that space in social, they inhabit that identity in social spaces. In some cases, they might commission someone to make a fursuit for them, which is like a head to toe, in many cases, physical costume of their performative identity, and go with it from there. And in these spaces, because these communities are often neurodivergent and queer, they often find themselves targeted for harassment in different contexts, especially since furries are seen as cringe in lots of parts of the internet. And as a result of that, what you end up with is a community that is able to move effortlessly between different kinds of infrastructures, and in many cases build their own infrastructure. And so what you get out of that is like this circular economy, and this is, again, actually, I will bring this up while I talk. What you get out of this is a community that understands entirely where it, how to evaluate and understand the impacts of technology. And it's just down here. It's a little bit hard to read, but basically what we have here is when you have a besiegement from the external society and you mix it with abundance of tech labor from, you know, very online furries. There's a joke that a lot of furries work in digital infrastructure. They like DevOps and web engineers and things like that. And then when you combine that with these inclusive spaces where the participants are materially underserved, you get this kind of Venn diagram that creates a kind of ecosystem where people feel safe, they share knowledge, and they begin to be stronger together by adopting a combination of the for-profit centralized systems that exist that serve their needs, such as Twitch or Twitter or whatever. But then when they find those gaps, or when they're threatened as a community, they then build their own community-led infrastructure, and they build their own marketplaces in order to fund those things, and you get this kind of tight-knit, completely distributed and decentralized system that the properties of which have become the furry subculture. And I think there's a lot more I wanted to say on this, but as provocations, I think these are a good starting point. I feel as though if we're able to meet these people where they are, for example, if we start looking at the success stories that we have, the massive success stories like Blender, for example, like OBS and other tools, like the Steam Deck, the Valve software handheld gaming device that runs on Linux. If we look at these and we ask ourselves, how can we reproduce these at a wider level, at a systemic, conceptual level collectively, then perhaps we can escape the kind of stagnation that we see that leads to us in these kinds of situations where we're reliant on reliant on small amounts of money pushed by people who essentially have not a stagnant idea of how the world should work. And with that, I think I went 5 minutes over. No, 10 minutes over, so I will leave it there. So thank you so much. Yeah, and we guess we can open up for questions. It's so hot up here as well. 2 minutes for questions? Do we have any? I kind of just bounced. Okay, there's two at the back. Yeah. These lights are actually way hotter than they looked from the audience. I'm like dying here. That doesn't mean don't ask questions though. I'm sorry.
Hello. Yeah, wow, that was amazing. Thanks a lot. When you showed the graphs of like people in FOSS at what age, could this not be read differently, that there are more people not leaving FOSS? So back in like 2000, there were 20-year-olds, people who would be at university, who could do FOSS stuff, and universities involved in that. But then they get a job, and there are not that many jobs where you could do FOSS. Whereas now I think the landscape is very different. There's way more successful FOSS projects, and more companies are getting involved in contributing to open source, that now you can, more people are staying in FOSS. And that's why we see more older people, like the graph seems to be shifting to the right. But
yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, that could be, that's what, 100%, and I hope that's what's happening. But if it's not, it's really concerning, right? Like the problem is like nobody knows, right? In the research that we've been doing, we don't have, there's no good answer. Nobody actually knows whether that's what it is or not. When we present that, that's the kind of alternative that comes up, which is like, it's probably more like that, what you've just said there. And if that's true, that's excellent. But if it's not true, we're in serious trouble. And we don't know if, like, I don't think anyone knows.
I think it would be worth checking, like, how many people are involved, rather than...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. And I hope that it is that. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, my question goes in a similar kind of vein. So do you have a theory when you're saying people are dropping out of FOSS, why they are not translating the same thing that before? You said locked platforms, and that is kind of true. My first mobile-like device was an iPod Touch, and I went immediately to jpegme.com. But like in my early days, I did a lot of game modding, just like the ones you showed right now. And I think they're building up infrastructure, so they're probably using open source stuff and stuff. Those are the groups of interested tech-literal people that will translate into open source, hopefully, eventually. So if your theory is they're not translating to FOSS, why do people currently in that kind of space have trouble migrating over like all of our generations did?
But I think that's a good, and I think that you're exactly right there, where like historically that the pathway from game mods into open source is like is a one there's probably a half dozen people in this room that have had that story. I think the answer is that it ties in with this lots of different things, such as like the decline of interest in encryption from younger generations or things like that. A really good example of how this can happen on a broader level is like, and again, this is too much for just what we're talking about here today, but like when Telegram was launched, one of the earliest groups, one of its first user bases were the furry community. And part of the reason why furries moved to Telegram was because it was the first messenger. Firstly, it worked on like a whole bunch of systems, but also it had stickers. And so it was able to tie into the idea of like being able to send expressive emojis, if you like, through stickers that were custom built for different performative identities, different personas, right? And so these sorts of things, it's those sorts of playfulness, that kind of thing, that brings people into FOSS in similar kinds of ways. So again, OBS, the use of OBS in Blender and writing Blender plugins is another way people come into them. I think broadly speaking though, is that over the course of 15 years, the main thing here is that there's less of a more general interest in tinkering with the machine itself and more of an interest in tinkering with parts of the machine, right? And I think the complexity of that is where that subtlety exists. But I'd love to talk with you more about that as well. Yeah. And anyone else? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we're done. Thank you. Thank you.